And how many of us used them instead of reading Shakespeare before the big exam? Yeah, I did, absolutely. Shakespeare, seriously. Our scripture this morning is from Deuteronomy, and the title from the chapter in some versions says that this is the essence of the law. So if we hear that, we have to think that this is what the Ten Commandments is distilled into. This passage comes to us when Moses has come down from the mountain for the second time with the second set of tablets. Remember that he smashed the first set in anger against the Israelites. So this is the Coles Notes of the Ten Commandments. I mean, yes, they are all incredibly important, but this is the essence. This is the Coles Notes of what is important, what God is asking of the people of Israel. The Amplified Bible begins this passage this way. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you but to fear and worship the Lord your God with awe-filled reverence and profound respect, to walk, that is, to live each and every day in all his ways, and to love him and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, your choices, your thoughts, your whole being, and to keep the commandments of the Lord. And then it goes on to say, the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God who does not show particularity or take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and he shows his love for the stranger, the resident alien, the foreigner, by giving him food and clothing. Therefore you show love for the stranger. Here it is. Here is the core of what our God asks of us. And this is repeated over and over again throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament, several times, particularly in Micah 6, where it says, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your God? And of course, our Lord Jesus Christ paraphrased this so succinctly in Matthew 22 when asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And here on Pastoral Care Sunday, we're focused on this passage because it speaks to us about care for others. It speaks to us about seeking justice for others and exhibiting loving kindness out of our love for our mighty and awesome God. And through his love for us is born our love for others. It is what we are tasked with doing by God, by the law and the prophets, and by Jesus Christ himself. Seeking justice for those who can't seek their own. Loving kindness, loving, caring for widows and orphans. Now, in biblical times, widows and orphans were the least of society. Those were the ones who were shunted off to the side. They had no family to care for them, and they were often left hungry and homeless. And while we may not characterize them as widows and orphans today, there is absolutely no doubt in our mind that the hungry, the homeless, and the hurting are still very much with us. I want to talk to you about these two things, seeking justice and loving kindness. So first, let me talk about justice. And as God would have it, there was an article this week in the Globe and Mail that speaks to this so eloquently. It talked about our Presbyterian Church in Canada's commitment to the Healing and Reconciliation Initiative. This was a justice-seeking board that was commissioned to rectify the atrocities perpetrated in the residential schools. And we know, to our shame, that these were largely committed by people who represented churches running the schools. People who did not walk humbly with their God. People who did not show kindness for those in their care. People who, in fact, made orphans where there were none. Taking children from their homes and segregating them in schools with an agenda to indoctrinating them to the European way of life and to force them into Christianity. Forcing into Christianity. It boggles the mind, doesn't it? And our shame, and it is our shame, is that it took so long for us to even own up to the issue. And now we read in the Globe and Mail that the funds that the churches were charged with raising, well, this hasn't come to fruition. Let me read to you from the article. The failure of the Catholic Church's fundraising efforts for Aboriginal healing and reconciliation means that other churches involved in the notorious residential schools have been let off the hook for more than $3 million in contributions. In fact, the Catholic fundraising program collected just $3.7 million towards its $25 million goal. This reduced the totals required from the Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches because each had signed a deal with the federal government that linked their contributions to Aboriginal healing to those of the Catholics. Catholic organizations ran most of the residential schools and had the largest financial obligation of any church under Canada's 2007 settlement that ended thousands of individual and class action suits. The federal government spent an estimated $5 billion directly compensating the 79,000 survivors. The Anglican Church was allowed to keep the $2.7 million it had raised for healing and return it to the local churches. A church spokesman said many of these communities had set up healing programs with their share of the money. The United Church was allowed to reduce its maximum obligation by $450,000, a church spokesman said. The Presbyterian Church had already put its maximum obligation of $1.3 million toward healing programs and therefore was contractually not in a position to receive anything back. The church says it effectively waived its right to get money back. Mr. Rudin, who was a spokesperson and not involved in the 2007 settlement, was critical of the church and the churches whose obligations were reduced. If someone says, "Oh, it's too hard, and no one wants to give us money for this," and that ends it, that doesn't speak much to people's commitment to reconciliation, he said of the Catholic groups. The same goes for the other churches. To rely on what is essentially a loophole and say, "We're now free from obligations again," doesn't speak to their real commitment to reconciliation. It's very sad to see this from the churches, particularly the Catholic churches, but the other churches as well. He added that the Presbyterians deserve credit for saying, "It doesn't matter that we can legally avoid this responsibility. We know morally we can't." Stephen Kendall, the principal clerk of General Assembly, which ran two of the schools, said his church quickly met its fundraising obligations of $1.3 million under the settlement agreement. When we provided our contribution to the agreement, we made that contribution as if the full Catholic amount were raised. And at the time we said that we consider this our contribution to the agreement and we don't expect any refund. So we waived any possible right of refund early on. What jumped out to me as I read this article was what he said. He added that the Presbyterians deserve credit for saying, it doesn't matter that we can legally avoid this responsibility. We know morally we shouldn't. And there it is. Our commitment to what it tells us to do in Deuteronomy, to seek justice. The Lord your God is the God of God and the Lord of lords. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow. We should be proud of our national church for their commitment on our behalf in seeking justice, for doing what is right and just, and now in the aftermath, saying, no, we don't want a refund. Justice for where we have gone wrong doesn't have an expiry, a take back, a loophole that we can use to subvert our obligation to do what is right. Seeking justice, loving kindness. And that is something that we are particularly good at here. Our pastoral care team is amazing. And indeed, we are so fortunate to have one. Many of my clergy friends, when I tell them what an amazing pastoral care team I have, they're jealous. They're in awe. They are so, it's just an amazing thing that so many churches don't even have. But we're committed to it here. And as Joyce said, if you read in your bulletin, here's what they do. She said hospital visiting, but every single week, these people go to the hospitals to bring joy and cheer into what is time of trial. They do nursing home visiting. They take the time to sit and listen and talk with those who are lonely. And quite often, those people don't even know them anymore. But that doesn't mean they don't go. That doesn't mean they don't share care and compassion. Student oversight. Our young people have gone away from home in many cases, and these cards that they get are just a small reminder that this family of faith still cares, still thinks of them, still worries about them, lets them know they're not alone. They send regular cards to shut-ins. And when we think about that, when we are confined to home through illness or age, to have that little bit of joy, that card arrive in the mail to brighten the day, when they're unable to come and be with us, it's an amazing thing. When I go to visit, quite often I'll say that if you can't come to St. Giles will come to you. And that's what these cards do for those people. And I know this group does so much more. There's grief support and support for times of trial, a friendly face, an ear to listen, a shoulder to lean or cry on. Going above and beyond in so many simple ways. Even as simple as finding home care or taking a meal, making a phone call to say hi, we're thinking of you. Maybe it's picking up groceries for a shut-in, or giving them a ride to church. It's on your way anyway. And I know that there have been so many instances of care that they have demonstrated, little things that mean a lot to someone who's struggling or hurting or lonely. And as I've been saying these things, is there something that you have said to yourself, I can do that. This is something small that I can do. This is a way that I can answer the call of God to love kindness, to show love for the stranger, by giving him food and clothing, by loving the stranger as God commanded. And it isn't always the grand gesture that makes a difference. It's often the little moments of kindness that get us through the day. So is there something that has resonated with you, some way that you could come alongside this team in caring? If there is, speak to Joe McDonnell or Joyce Stairs today. And rest assured, they're not going to jump all over you to join the team, unless you want to, of course. They will just be exceedingly happy and grateful that you want to share in the care that they offer. And if you're not sure how you can help, but you think you want to, you know what? Go ahead. Talk to these ladies. They will be only too happy to talk to you and find a niche where you can fit into. By showing kindness in any way that you can. And sometimes it's just as simple as listening. Being there, offering that ear or that shoulder. All too often, we try to jump in and fix things rather than listening. And we know deep down that we can't fix it because that's mostly God's job. But what we can do is listen. Be there. Show kindness and love and care and mercy. You see, here's the deal. The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved by us. It simply wants to be heard, to be witnessed, to be seen exactly as what it is, hurting. When we make that deep bow to the soul of a suffering person, our respect for their hurting reinforces the Spirit's healing resources. God's the only resource that really will heal or fix. Witnessing and listening, however, it takes time and patience, which we often lack, especially when we're in the presence of someone who is suffering so painfully that we can hardly stand to be there, as if we're in danger of catching what they have. We simply want to swoop in and fix it. Apply our fix and then cut and run, figuring we've done the best we can to save them, when we know that's not the case. We can't do the saving. We are not saviors. But being there in the long haul, as someone who sits and listens, that's often harder than swooping in and fixing and leaving. Is that you? Someone who can listen? We think we have to know the right words to say, the right things to do, but what is needed is the right attitude, one of care and compassion and respect and silence, listening, offering a hand or a hug. What does the Lord require of you? Micah 6 tells us that it isn't always a grand, showy thing. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. It isn't always the spectacle of generosity. It is this: seeking justice for those that can't seek it for themselves. Loving and showing kindness every chance we can. Maybe it's as simple as one meal for one family one day. Maybe it's a simple act of kindness that you don't even remember that makes a huge difference. How will you answer that call from God this week? Let's watch the video.